Next on our agenda is Ms. Dee Robinson. Thank you, and please proceed.
Good afternoon. Before I begin my formal presentation, I want to thank Senator Adams and Representative Birch for allowing me to come in here and testify in front of you, and I want to thank all the administrative staff members who have been helping me put this program together. Over the past few months, I was preparing a program. Much has happened in our country, in our world, and has left us collectively confused, disappointed, and maybe even fearful because the world leaders cannot collectively come together and do something to end the chaos. But in this microcosm that we lovingly call Kentucky, there are people who live in fear and despair. The difference is, you are the leaders who can help them. But I need a few heroes to step up and get a bill filed and passed. My name is Dee Robinson, and I am the administrator for Kentucky Citizens Against Animal Abuse. But I'm here today speaking for people, the silent members of our society, the abused children, our neglected seniors, and the weaker partners who cannot speak out or defend themselves against animal abusers who would hurt, neglect, and/or abuse them. Maybe their voice isn't as loud as ours because their cries have not been heard and they continue to live in fear and despair. For many, peace and loving kindness is something they pray for rather than a reality in their desperate lives. The powerful connection between interpersonal violence and domestic pet cruelty is well researched and documented. It's called the animal-human abuse syndrome, or the link. This recognition has been affecting rapid legislative changes across the country. The FBI has announced that starting next year, convicted animal abusers in federal cases will be considered Class A felons, and they will fall into the same group as arsonists and murderers. It's time for us to step up, put aside shallow rationale and unwarranted prejudice. This is not about denying hunters their rights, restricting good farmers, good breeders, their livelihoods. This isn't about supporting or disregarding HSUS or any of the radical advocacy groups that support it and then blame you for their failures. I'm not proposing new laws that deal with misdemeanors that can be handled with local ordinances, and this is certainly not a partisan issue. We are all simply Kentuckians when it comes to protecting each other, and this presentation is about protecting the lives of all of us, the people. Animal crime is the most visible sign that children, elderly, and vulnerable partners may be in danger of unmitigated violence and extreme neglect. Up until now, the proposed animal abuse legislation in Kentucky has been written for and promoted for the sole purpose of protecting animals, which in itself is a very noble cause. However, with the serious people problems we face in this world and in this state, people should be a priority in our state and in our government. It is understandable why previously filed domestic pet protection bills have failed. They didn't make a strong enough case for linking the welfare of people to the welfare of pets. If they had, there would have been more public support, and both vulnerable citizens and domestic pets would have been better protected by now. Some of us hear and read about these related cases every day. Others have no idea such evil even exists. Most never even make the connection or have even heard of the animal-human abuse syndrome. So it's almost understandable that they didn't actively support the domestic pet protection bills that have died in committee every year. Some special interest groups even feel their personal rights would be threatened by these bills and have actively and successfully campaigned against them in the past without fully understanding how limited but improved legislation could have benefited us all. They believe, as I do, that people, not pets, should be your priority. But there is no justifiable excuse to ignore the link between pet and people abuse any longer. I believe once the public and you our elected officials are fully aware of the facts, you will seek to protect the weaker members of our society by punishing the most wicked of all animal abusers. Batterers who commit pet abuse have higher rates of sexual violence, marital rape, emotional violence, stalking than non-pet abusing batterers. And they use more controlling behaviors such as male privilege, isolation, blaming, intimidation, threats, and economic abuse. Studies reveal that pet abusing batterers may even coerce women to commit crimes such as bank robbery, credit card theft, fraud, drug trafficking by threatening their companion animals. The Kentucky Supreme Court handed down a decision on October 29th affirming a lower court's ruling that the abuse of a pet was an acceptable consideration in the lethality analysis used in issuing a domestic violence restraining order. Because in 2013, a petition was filed in Jefferson County against a husband alleging controlling and unstable behaviors made his wife fear for her safety and that of their minor daughter. His actions included abusing the family pet in front of their daughter. There are devastating effects and statistics relating to the children who live in pet abusive homes. Abuse becomes the norm for them, and more often than not, they grow up to become abusers while being continually abused. We need bipartisan, reasonable, specific, limited, and properly worded legislation to go after these felonious criminals on a higher level. Plus, we need to include and engage special interest groups in Kentucky that have previously been excluded in the draft process before the bill is filed, so they know these new laws were not written to, nor will they infringe on their personal rights, something we're all very sensitive to these days. Perhaps if we include groups like the Kentucky Houndsmen and others in the bill draft process, we can avoid the time-consuming and negative campaigns that come from the misinterpretation of a word or a phrase like adequate care, continuous access, four-legged, and so on. We also need to limit this legislation. Local ordinances can deal with pet ownership regulations that are specific to that county's needs. 71% of all animal abusers go on to become senior, child, and spousal abusers. 71%. 1 out of every 3 women in Kentucky will be victims of domestic violence in their lifetime. And 85% of all the women who escape and seek shelter have already reported pet abuse in their homes. Recent studies find that 70% of victims either stay to protect their pets from the abusers or witness their pet being hurt before the abuser turns on them. Domestic pet abusers, for the most part, are criminally inclined. 70% of them have criminal records in all areas, not just domestic violence. They are not upstanding citizens. Animal abusers are 5 times more likely to commit violent crimes against people. You know, for many of us, pets are members of our family. We grew up with them as children, and we will grow old with them as adults. For many, they can be the sole source of companionship and affection. We see them seriously doing their tasks they've been trained to do in their work environments. They team up with us in leisure activities, and we do our best to protect them, and they do their best to protect us. But we need to do a better job protecting them from violent, evil, and abusive people. Using the FBI guidelines of prosecuting upcoming federal cases of gross neglect, intentional abuse and torture, sexual abuse, and organized abuse, which includes dogfighting, I am proposing a bill that will expand Kentucky Statute 525.135, the torture bill, commonly known as Romeo's Law, and make the following 4 first-time torture offense Class D felonies. Number 1, gross and deliberate neglect, including deprivation of food, water, lack of shelter that protects an animal from temperature extremes, and deprivation of needed medical attention, all of which causes the trauma associated with death or near death of a cat or dog. The pain that lingers with untreated illness or wounds or without nourishment or shelter can be tremendous, sometimes even more so than the victims who are directly have inflicted violence because their suffering is so prolonged. Animals that starve to death experience a myriad of painful symptoms throughout each stage of their physical deterioration, just like humans. During extremely cold spells and hot periods, it's not uncommon for animal control officers to find companion animals, often chained dogs, literally frozen to the ground or dead from heat prostration because of lack of proper shelter from the elements. Deliberate negligence is torture, and it should be treated as such. The finite definition of adequate becomes meaningless when the animal is dead. Obviously, it didn't get sufficient care to sustain life. Vulnerable humans, such as seniors and children, are way too often the victims of those who would commit crimes of gross neglect on pets. They are just as neglectful of the people who depend on them to live as their pets are. Number 2, extreme torture or deliberate physical abuse that results in the death or near death of a cat or dog. When you think you have heard and seen every way a pet can be abused and tortured, from dragging them behind a car, to skinning them alive, to burning them to death, to dismembering their body parts, electrocuting them, hanging them, poisoning them, beating them to death, abusers come up with something else to shock our souls and hurt our hearts. In domestic violence, child abuse, and elder abuse, the abusers do this to silence their victims about an incident or to prevent them from leaving a violent relationship. Abusers kill, torture, and threaten animals to exert power over their human victims and to illustrate what could happen to them. 100% of all convicted serial killers began their killing sprees on animals. Fact. Number 3, the sexual assault of an animal. If a person touches, contacts, or causes an object or another person to touch or contact the mouth, anus, or sex organs of an animal or an animal carcass for the purpose of arousing or gratifying the sexual desire of a person or an animal, it is torture. The sexual abuse of an animal is often linked to the sexual abuse of women and children. Bestiality at its core is a form of animal abuse, regardless of the human perpetrator's beliefs or intention. Bestiality is more than a cultural taboo. It's a serious offense that is closely tied to the violence and sexual abuse of humans. It often involves the use of animals for degradation and sexual exploitation of a battered partner. Child sex abusers may also sexually abuse animals to enhance, expand, or extend the abuse of their powerless and unsuspecting victims. 40% of the perpetrators of sexually motivated homicides have reported they previously sexually abused animals. There is no law in Kentucky that prohibits the sexual abuse of an animal. And it's hurtful to think that we need one, but we do. Lastly, number 4, dogfighting, which includes owning, possessing, keeping, breeding, training, selling, stealing, or otherwise transferring a dog for the purpose of that animal or its offspring being used for bait or fighting for pleasure and profit. Attending and watching and participating in dogfighting or training of these dogs should be a violation of the statute. Dogfighting is one of the most heinous acts of violence and cruelty towards animals. It is an organized, conscious choice by dangerous, violent sociopaths who break the laws to brutally torture, mutilate, and murder dogs for fun and money. The dogs that lose these fights are usually killed by shooting, drowning, electrocution, hanging, and other unspeakable methods. Our pets are stolen and used as blood bait and training, only to be ripped to shreds and die violent deaths. The isolation and abuse that these dogs endure before, after, and during the fight is unthinkable torture. For many years, even after it was outlawed, dogfighting was considered an isolated animal welfare issue, and such was ignored, denied, or disregarded by law enforcement agencies. However, it is now established that the dogfighting culture is often intimately connected with other criminal activity, with dogfighters frequently involved in organized crime, racketeering, drug distribution, gangs, and the dogfighting events facilitate gambling and drug trafficking. I am asking you all to unanimously support legislation in the House and Senate and pass a bill that will enhance and expand Kentucky Statute 525-135 with appropriate pre- and post-conviction stipulations, and a felonious pet abusers registry, which was just recently enacted in Tennessee. Romeo was a tortured dog that died at the hands of his abuser and got a lot of media attention. Perhaps there isn't any glory in preemptive action compared to reactive efforts, but if it saves the life of one vulnerable human or child who has suffered and failed to be heard, isn't it worth it? We can work together. We can do this without HSUS influence and without their interference. You proved during a short session with the passage of HB 8 how efficient your legislative process can be. The bill was introduced on February 4th and signed into law on April 1st. Both parties spoke up for those in need, and you spoiled us all in the process. Good people don't commit crimes of gross neglect, extreme physical abuse, sexual abuse, or dogfighting. The criminals who do are some of the worst members in our society. Animal abusers put us all, and those we know and love, at risk, and none of us are safe until this changes. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Do we have any questions from the committee members? All right, seeing none, thank you very much. We'll be in touch.